the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College.
This is Crystal Downing, and I am joined by my co-director at the Marion E. Wade Center, David Downing, and our wonderful podcast producer to continue a conversation started our last podcast about the importance of George MacDonald in the thinking of other authors that are archived at the Wade Center. Last time, we specifically looked at C.S. Lewis and how he collected some of his favorite quotations from MacDonald. And this time, we're going to look at two children's books written by MacDonald that were profoundly influential on both Tolkien and G.K. Chesterton. And we may talk about Lewis reading them as well.
Not to mention Lewis Carroll, Mark Twain, Madeleine L'Engle, Neil Gaiman. There's quite a list of people who feel they've been influenced by these stories.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. And the one that really stands out in people's memory is an 1872 publication called The Princess and the Goblin. Tolkien actually testified that both The Princess and the Goblin and then a follow-up book 9 years later called The Princess and Curdie, so published 1883, he said, those books most affected the background of my imagination since childhood. And he read them to his own children.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So that's something we want to keep in mind as we discuss these. And then, of course, Chesterton also singled out The Princess and the Goblin as well as igniting imagination. And Aaron, you were just sharing with us an interesting statement about the power of imagination. Why don't you share that with our listeners?
Yeah, so I was reading an article by Colin Manlove, who is a well-known McDonald scholar. He's written a number of articles and books on McDonald. And he wrote an article, and he's talking about the wise women, which we're going to talk about later on. But he's talking about how McDonald's stories are designed to work. And so he says, they're not simply moral, but Christian. Salvation does not come through training so much as grace working in the imagination to heal the soul. Mm-hmm. And I thought that one phrase there, grace working in the imagination to heal the soul, it's a really good summary of what MacDonald is doing through his fairy tales and through his novels. And they are these kinds of myths, and there's all these weird supernatural elements to them, but they impact your imagination, and that in turn changes the way that you see the world and yourself and your own soul and what it means to be a good person. And so I thought that was a really good statement from Colin Manlove.
Yeah.
Well, let's start
How come I didn't get an adjective? You said, I'm here with my co-director, David, and our wonderful producer.
Well, I didn't get a name.
Oh, you didn't get a name? Oh.
You get a title and a name, and I get an adjective and a title.
Oh, okay.
That's how it works,
that's
David.
fair. Okay, that's fair.
Okay. Listeners, go back to earlier podcasts to hear other introductions. Okay, we're going to start with The Princess and the Goblin, since that was published first. And obviously, The Princess and Curdie is a sequel to The Princess and the Goblin.
Although there's a lot of Curdie in this first story.
Oh, there is.
I always get confused. I always say The Princess and Curdie thinking of the first story.
Yeah.
Because he's a major player in this story.
And I also want to call it The Princess and the Goblins, because there's not like there's just one.
Exactly.
Right.
That was going to be my question. Who is the goblin? Because it seems like there are many goblins in this story.
Is he talking about Hairlip?
Well, that is my only theory.
Gotcha.
It turns out there is a goblin that the goblins who live underground, the son of the king, they want to marry him off to an above-world princess, one of the sun people, in order to infuse that royalty into their race.
Yeah.
So
his
it might
name
be
Hairlip. Is
Hairlip.
sort of a lapse of taste on
McDonald's
part.
Yeah.
Mark Twain makes some jokes about Hairlip as well.
Can
obviously.
somebody, maybe before we get into talking more about the story, can somebody give just kind of a summary of just the overall story plot of?
Why don't you do that, David?
There is a young princess, 8 years old, named Irene. The British tend to say Irene rather than Irene.
Oh, okay.
And she goes upstairs and discovers that in her attic, there's this beautiful woman who's very, very, very old. She looks like she might be 50 years old. Thanks a lot, George.
I knew you were going to comment on that.
Yeah. And she has this great spinning wheel, and she's this beautiful woman. And she says, I'm your great-great-grandmother. And it's interesting because she's kind of a image of divine providence. She's almost a god figure, but she's female.
Yeah.
So the princess goes back down to her nurse and says, I saw this wonderful vision, and the nurse doesn't believe her.
Yeah.
And the nurse's name is Ludi. McDonald had strange ideas about names.
Yeah. Sometimes he nails it on the head, and then sometimes you're like, okay, Ludi, all right.
Yeah, it's Looti. And she doesn't believe the princess saw this wonderful woman up in the attic, which reminds you of poor Lucy when she comes back from the wardrobe.
Yes. Yeah.
You can see the footprints of McDonald all over the...
Oh, yeah. Chronicles of Narnia.
I say fingerprints, not footprints. So she comes back, doesn't believe them. In the meantime, Ludi doesn't want Princess Irene going out in the nighttime because there are goblins underneath the castle, and they are impish, evil creatures that come out and kidnap people and do bad things.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember all the plot details. The main thing I remember is there's a beautiful miner's boy, a good-looking young kid who's a miner's boy who overhears a plot by the goblins to kidnap Irene, the little girl, and take her to become the bride of Hairlip, one of the prince of the goblins. There's an odd detail that goblins are very sturdy and hard to fight, except if you step on their toes. That's their vulnerable spot.
Well, not their toes.
They don't have toes.
Yeah,
excuse me, on their feet.
Yeah, because there's a weird scene where the goblins are talking to each other about this human female that was married to the king in the past, which kind of sets up the precedent for why they want to kidnap the princess now. And she wore shoes. And so now the queen always wears shoes. It's sort of followed this tradition. And they're like, because they have these protuberances from their feet, like 5 protuberances from their feet, like it's this weird thing.
Humans do. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
But theirs are just a solid mass, which for some reason sounds even creepier. And he has some comment about maybe in the past proto-humans didn't have toes or something like that. So
once again, I remember the silver chair, the gnomes. Some of them have no toes and some have 10 toes.
Yeah.
There's something about toes. Yes, I didn't mean toes. I should have said feet. Should we say insteps? Does he ever use the word instep?
No.
The queen of the goblins wears stone shoes. It's interesting that Tolkien mocked that detail. He felt it's so silly to have these evil, sturdy creatures that all you have to do is stomp on their feet. But then there's a scene in The Lord of the Rings where this, is he a mountain goblin? He's breaking into the Hall of Records where all our heroes are.
Uh-huh.
And Boromir tries to stab him in the arm, and his arm is so sturdy, Boromir's sword bounces off his arm.
Yeah.
But then Frodo goes and stabs this mountain troll in the foot.
Yep.
And it bleeds black blood, and it goes, ouch, and pulls its foot back.
Yeah.
And either consciously or unconsciously, I believe that's a Tolkienian tribute to the princess and the goblin.
Right. Well, we know he read it multiple times since he read it to his children.
So Curdie knows the mines very well, but his way of knowing his way around is to tie a string to a rock, and so that he doesn't get lost, he can always ravel up the string and find out where he started. But the goblins move the rocks, so he gets lost about where he is in the caves. Now, the grandmother Irene, same name as the princess Irene, she says, a name is something that you can keep yourself and also give it away, which is some kind of an interesting spiritual metaphor, I think. But she has this invisible thread that she gives to Irene, and only Irene can see it. It's some kind of an image of providence that nobody else knows it, but you kind of know where you are and you know where you're going because you have an invisible thread that ties you to this benevolent grandmother in the attic.
Mm-hmm. So I was going to ask, there seems to be a consistent theme throughout this one of being able to find your way home.
It's true.
And what home is. Right. And so there's early on, there's an incident where they're out on the mountain and they're they're walking around, and they get further and further from home because Irene wants to go further up the mountain, and then they realize it's getting dark and they've got to run back, and they get so excited that they end up running in the wrong direction, and that's where they run into Curdie. And they see these sort of goblins, and these shapes and stuff, and they're scared. And Curdie has to sing a minor song. He has to sort of make up this song that scares them off. Which I was going to ask you. I'd like to talk about that. Where does he get that idea of the goblins are afraid of verse?
Well, in Kalevala, there's a figure who sings evil creatures away. And then it shows up again in Tom Bombadil when he wants to get rid of Old Man Willow or the Barrow Wight. He starts singing songs. Frankly, from Tom Bombadil's songs, I don't blame them for running away.
I know, right?
But I think
that was the same feeling. I was reading through the story again, and it was very much like some of the Lord of the Rings stuff where you hit the songs and you're like, okay, I'm gonna skip this.
Well, and then this is an interesting detail because McDonald throws in that not only does verse scare goblins away, but especially if it's verse you made up yourself.
Yeah.
So that they have never heard it before.
Yeah.
And there's something there about the power of poetry. We know that MacDonald himself was a poet and highly valued poetry. And the fact that this miner's son can have this ability to put words together that have power.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think his favorite, my mother loved his book of poems called Diary of an Old Soul. I never read it as a kid because I didn't feel like an old soul. So I said, well, that must be for someone else.
It's interesting. George MacDonald translated a number of poems or hymns from Novalis, and then gave them as gifts to people. So he was very fascinated with poetry. He just wasn't very good at it, kind of like Lewis.
And in many of his novels, he just throws in passages of poetry. He fits them into the narrative where someone breaks out in song or is given a poem.
Yeah.
So he really values poetry. So it's a nice little touch, even though these are more incantatory that Curdie sings to scare away the goblins. But essentially, he saves the princess and her nurse, takes them back to their home, and the princess wants to give him a kiss as a thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And the nurse is appalled by that. And one of the things you see that MacDonald, in both these fairy tales, it is attacking is this sense of aristocratic privilege of certain people looking down on other people, like where the little princess lives. Most of the people part of that castle look down on the miners because they're working class.
Right.
Yeah.
And here it's a working class miner, and his parents are some of the most noble people in the book.
That's true. A lot of his realistic novels.
Yes.
He was raised in poverty, and his father had a humble job. But we talked last week about his great admiration for his father. I think of Sir Gibby and a number of realistic novels. Lower class people are really portrayed very sympathetically and often more spiritually sensitive than the nobility.
I started that thing about them getting lost on the mountain and running into Curdie because I wanted to mention there's a key line in there. He says, you wouldn't have lost your way if you hadn't been so frightened, said the boy. And there's a bunch of lines about, take me home and find my home.
Yeah, that is
and
true.
It's a big theme in the story. And so I just wanted to ask about that. What's the message he's trying to get across here? Because later on in the story, Irene goes up to see her grandmother, and she has been spinning. The thing that she's been spinning this whole time is this really thin, almost invisible thread, and it's tied to a ring that if she just kind of pulls on it, eventually it will bring her back home. And then she has this statement where she essentially says, like, can this be my home? I want this where you are, grandmother, to be my home. And so there's this big theme about finding your way home and strings and things like that. What is MacDonald trying to do with that?
He did move around a lot. He grew up in Huntley, Aberdeenshire, very humble circumstances. He tried to go to med school but didn't have enough money. As an adult, he moved around a lot, first because he was an itinerant pastor. He was in Manchester for a while. Then he's down south, Arundel. They didn't like his preaching. They thought it was too inclusivist or universalist. But he ended up traveling to America. He lived in Italy for a while and didn't come back to England until his later years. So some of that may be his actual life, always wondering, where is my home? But the other side, I think, would be, well, ultimately our home is in heaven. Ultimately, being tied to God is the invisible anchor that goes with us regardless of where we are.
That's interesting you say that, because
I always say interesting things.
There's a line when we are introduced to Curdie's parents, and her name is Joan Peterson, which touches me because my mother's name was Joy Peterson. But it says that she had made a heaven of her house.
Oh, right.
Even though it's this poor little miner's cottage.
Yeah.
And so that comes immediately after a description of the princess being with her fairy tale like great-great-grandmother spinning in the attic, and this constant light going and jewels and beauty. And so that is kind of the conventional view of the fairy tale, like your fairy godmother. And McDonald wants to take that convention and say that even the lower class normal person can create a heaven in their home. And she is someone who operates with love and integrity.
Yeah.
That kind of happens with their own McDonald family. He had a lot of children, several of whom died untimely deaths, but their family life was very rich. He had a number of intellectuals and cultured people in his own background, but even though they were in straitened circumstances, they would put on plays. Their play of Pilgrim's Progress was so good that they actually toured and filled audiences with it. Yeah, but they would have musical expositions, and they really considered the family kind of a mini society. He created this very rich sense of literature and culture right there in the family. They didn't have to go somewhere to appreciate beauty or intellectual stimulation.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I was going to quote that passage. Her grandmother tells her that she needs to, and she says, "You must go downstairs." And then I highlighted this because I thought it was significant. And Irene says, "I'm so glad, grandmother, you didn't say go home, for this is my home. Mayn't I call this my home?" And then she says, You may, my child. And I trust you will always think it your home. And so there's just this ongoing theme there. And then there's a very heartwarming scene where she sleeps with her grandmother, and then she wakes up in her own bed. And so there just seems to be this ongoing theme of the princess finding comfort in her great grandmother, and then also when she has the encounter with her father and hugging him, and her hair blends in with his beard, and just all very touching and warm pictures of family relationships in the story. And then even Curdie's family, his mother is very loving. And
Right. Even there is a significant element about the father because he's usually not there. So he is off visiting. He's the king. He's visiting his realm. He's trying to do what's best for his subjects. And so the princess is just left in the castle and discovering this great-great-grandmother who is like a supernatural being, because sometimes she looks old with white hair, other times she appears young with this long blonde hair.
Yeah.
In the next novel, she appears as a young housemaid. She can take any type of form. So it struck me that goes along with what we were talking about in our last podcast, that ultimately the ultimate home is the one we love is our God.
Yeah.
But rather than naming God, this is a fairy tale.
Yeah.
And so this great-great-grandmother becomes the God figure in this text.
Our hearts are restless till they rest in thee.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Augustine.
There's almost like, I would almost say I think the father and the grandmother are both kind of images of God in the way that they're portrayed. So because she finds that same level of comfort, I think, in both of them. It's almost like the father's like the son because he's there and then he leaves and he's going to come back again. He leaves people in charge. felt like that.
He only eats wine and bread.
No.
No, that's true.
Oh, he does?
He only eats wine and bread in that hideous strength. Ransom is in an upper room.
Yeah.
And when Jane Studick goes to meet him, it's very much you go up the stairs, you go into this room, and then there's this person who's old, but he looks like a 20-year-old boy with a golden beard.
Yeah.
No, I'm talking about that hideous strength.
Oh, sorry.
And I think it's based on the idea that you go up the stairs into this upper room, and there Ransom looks like a king. And he tells Jane Studick, I only eat bread and wine like the king in Curdie. He actually mentions this story
really?
In that hideous strength.
Oh, cool.
Right.
Wow, I guess I didn't notice that he only eats bread and wine.
That is the next one. The Princess and Curdie. That's in it. But we're talking about
The Princess and the Goblin?
Doesn't the king show up and
in this
he
one?
shows up, but the bread and wine and his illness is in the next one.
Okay, I tend to confuse the two because the
They
stories
are
have
easy
similar
to confuse.
characters
It is.
Yes.
and similar conspiracy.
Yes.
I wanted to mention when he comes back, I thought it was neat. They blow these bugles, and to her, it sounds like Irene, I am come. And it just, to me, with the blowing of the horn and everything, it just felt like a lot of echoes of Christ. You know, he's going to return.
Mm-hmm.
But the emphasis on the great-great-grandmother is tied to belief.
Yeah.
You only can see her if you believe her.
Yeah.
And maybe there's something going on where the king is like God the Son and the great-great-grandmother is like God the Father.
Yeah.
That's a possibility, but we don't want to allegorize it.
No, because I don't
too
think
much.
that's what he's doing here. I think they're just sort of images and hints. It's he's impacting your imagination and getting you to think about things in a different way.
And
Lewis said that McDonald was the great myth maker.
Yes.
He said it's not allegory exactly, and it's not straight realistic fiction, but he gives these archetypal stories that stick in your imagination, even if you can't quite understand them. I think we'll probably talk later on maybe about the day boy and the night girl. And there's a little boy who only lives in the daytime and never sees night, and a little girl who only sees night and never sees the day. And then they meet and they try to explain to each other what the day is like and what the night is like. And it's a very intriguing story, but when you're done, you can't put a very clear interpretive scheme on it.
Yeah.
You can't say, oh, this is what that meant.
I think that's the hard thing with this is that you can't go, okay, this is that and this is that and this is that. There's just all these different beautiful pictures that impact your imagination. And it, because you can't solve it, you think about it more often about what she might mean. And then it may mean something to you that it doesn't mean to somebody else. You know, I can imagine somebody who's had an awful home life, you know, that scene with her when she sleeps with the grandmother at night and she feels safe, you know, that might really resonate with them. So there's no way to know. Right.
And that is a good comment because people have a tendency to want to allegorize. They want to allegorize Tolkien, which made him just really mad because it takes more mental energy just to engage with the story without lowering it to the status of this represents this and this represents this. But it is the case that the grandmother cannot be seen unless you believe in her, because when the princess brings Curdie to the upper room, he can't see the grandmother. He feels that he's been made a mockery of because it's just this empty room with straw and just cobwebs. And the princess is shocked that he can't see what she can see.
Yeah.
But it is, I think, David, you mentioned earlier, it's like Lucy in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Well, that comes up a lot. It comes up in the last battle where the dwarves go inside the stable.
Oh, yeah.
And the children see the new Narnia. Basically, they're seeing heaven. They're ready to enter into the eternal realm of being with Aslan. But the dwarves don't see anything but straw and other things you see in the stable.
Yeah.
Yes.
It comes up again until we have faces, where Psyche says, look at the beautiful palace. You know, here's a goblet of wine for you to drink.
Yeah.
But her sister, O'Rule, or what did we say it was, Crystal? Lately?
O'Rule.
We don't know how to say it.
The Baltimore Orioles.
But she can't see the palace. She thinks, well, you're just sipping out of a stream. There's no goblet there. So Lewis loved the idea that not only is seeing is believing, but sometimes believing is seeing.
Yeah. Well, can we talk about another thing? again, this is hard to pin down, so I don't know if there's a definitive interpretation. But can we talk about the rose fire and the grandmother healing? So there's an incident early on where where Irene gets her finger gets pricked or something, and they try and put a poultice on it.
Right.
But she wakes up in the middle of the night and it's just throbbing, and she wants to talk to this soldier that's protecting her, and she goes out, and then, like other times in the story, she kind of accidentally ends up finding her way up to her grandmother, and her great-grandmother heals her finger by putting these oils on them. But in that scene, there's this description of this fire that looks like roses, and then later on, she places Curdie's hand in the rose fire.
Right.
That's the next novel.
That's the next novel.
Yes.
Okay, the next novel.
Well, I agree.
Well, what's going on there?
In
with
some
the
ways,
rose
they're
fire?
kind of a continuous story. When we interviewed Tim Larson, I asked him about the rose fire, and he said, I read that in my devotions. He said it's so spiritually rich that Irene wants Curdie to put his hand in the rose fire. Even though it's roses, it is a fire. And he puts his hand in, and it really hurts, just like it would be to put your hand in a fire. And he weeps, and he looks back at grandmother Irene, and she's also weeping. And she says, well, I too have put my hand in the fire.
Right.
So he suffers, but she knows exactly what he's suffering. And then when he touches this ugly creature named Lena, who looks almost like this bestial monstrosity, he feels it's actually the spirit of a beautiful little girl. And so somehow his hands have learned how to see the spirit of a person rather than to look on the outward appearance. Right. It's another very spiritually rich episode, very suggestive, evocative.
Well, and once again, that jumps over to the second novel, The Princess and Curdie.
Yeah, we're kind of mixing them together now.
well, let's talk about the second novel.
Well,
then.
Now, was that in Planet of the Apes or Beneath the Planet of the Apes? I can't remember which one. Well, that'd be a good title for the sequel, Beneath the Planet of Prince. And wouldn't that be get down there in the mines? Excuse me, Crystal.
The Rose Fire just briefly enters this first novel.
Yeah.
When Irene has been chased out of her room by some kind of creature, and she gets
the long-legged cat. What an odd image that was.
I know.
Yeah.
And she gets all muddy, and she runs up to her grandmother's, and the grandmother hugs her, but it gets mud on the grandmother's clothing. And so the grandmother puts her hand in the fire, and it cleans all the mud off her clothes. And so Irene understandably says, oh, well, do that to my clothes. And the grandmother says, no, you are not ready for it yet.
Yeah. And there's, I wanted to read a passage from that same incident. It says, Irene sat down in the low chair, and her grandmother left her, shutting the door behind her. The child sat gazing now at the rose fire, now at the starry walls, now at the silver light, and a great quietness grew in her heart. If all the long-legged cats in the world had come rushing in at her, then she would not have been afraid of them for a moment. How this was, she could not tell. She only knew that there was no fear in her, and everything was so right and safe that it could not get in. So even just looking on the rose fire creates this intense feeling of safety and security in her after this fearful incident with this long-legged cat.
And as David just explained, it's very important to the next novel. Any theories as to why a rose fire? Why make the fire of roses? Have you thought of that? It goes along with what we talked about in our last podcast, that God is a consuming fire, that God is burning away the filth in our life. And it's going to hurt when that is burned away. And little Irene in the first novel, she's only 8 years old. She's not ready for that filth to be burned away. In the next novel, Curdie, who's several years older, is ready, and it hurts him. And so that goes along precisely with what we were talking about in our last podcast, that God is a consuming fire. But why rose fire?
I will hazard a guess. Like many of our other authors, George MacDonald loved Dante. And the image of paradise in Dante is this huge rose petal. And all the different, each petal is at a different level of heaven and a different approach to the throne of God. So it could have something to do with Dante's great rose. Obviously, the English love their roses. So they're beautiful, they're fragrant, but they have thorns. And so it's an interesting juxtaposition of beauty, fragrance, but danger and pain. I just realized what a spiritual person you are, Crystal, because I'll say don't we need to do a wash? And you say, you're not yet ready. And so I just realized now there's a spiritual element to that one.
The other thing I would say is he was a big fan of novellas. And he was very heavily influenced by this novel. I've mentioned it before, Henry von Ofterdingen.
Oh, the blue flower.
Well, there's a blue flower in there, but there's actually a number of roses. Oh. It's a series of standalone stories, like every chapter. Well, there's a couple chapters that are knitted together where they go and they meet this poet and he's training. But there's a bunch of episodic instances. There's one with miners in the story where they encounter a bunch of miners. Again, this is kind of a big theme that was going on back then with, mines were different and supernatural and people went under the ground and what were they doing down there? So it was very mysterious. So it was a good sort of supernatural thing to talk about in industrial, Victorian times. But anyways, there's a number of roses and significant roses and flowers in that story. And so, I don't know, maybe that's part of it. I think it was just a thing back then, but I don't know.
I want to write this novel about this character. Shall I call him Franz Schmidt? Or shall I call him, Hans? No, Henry von Ofterdingen. Now I've got it. I finally had the great creative breakthrough.
Well, another precedent for this, The Princess and the Goblin, too, is the old Greek myth of Ariadne providing the clues so that Theseus can enter underground and kill the Minotaur. Very famous myth. But what McDonald does in this novel that I think is quite brilliant is first he shows Curdie using a thread, and it's actually in the chapter title called a clue. That's where we get our word clue from. It is a thread you follow to get to your goal. And the trouble is Curdie's thread, and it was a brilliant idea for him to be able to wander around and spy on the goblins, try to figure out what their nefarious activities happen to be. His thread gets tangled, and in fact, he has to bring it back to his mother, and it's his mother who's able to untangle the thread. Once again, the idea of the mother who has greater clarity. But then Irene's princess great-great-grandmother provides this invisible thread that we've talked about.
Yeah.
And by following that, Irene rescues Curdie.
Yeah.
Where the goblins have shut him up with rocks in a hole.
Yeah.
And Irene trusts the leading of this great-great-grandmother she believes in to rescue Curdie. Now, for a novel that was written in 1872, that's pretty interesting that it's the female who rescues the male.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole God figure, we wouldn't say too symbolically, but the great-great-grandmother is the one who represents providence in this story.
Yeah.
I like the contrast that the earthly clue or the earthly twine, you can do your best with it, but the goblins might move the rock anchor or it might get tangled. The invisible divine twine, you can't see it, but it's much more trustworthy in the long term.
Yeah, that element of not being able to see it is very important. Yeah, definitely.
You have to just trust.
Yeah.
Trust where it is leading you.
Yeah. I wonder if in some alternative universe, people don't say clueless. They say, you're so twineless.
I wanted to mention two potential parallels to get y'all's opinion on them. So there's the initial incident when she goes to find her grandmother the first time. It's raining, and McDonald starts talking about this humming sound, this low, sweet humming sound that goes on.
Yeah.
And it really reminded me of the scene from The Magician's Nephew where they hear the rings and the rings are making a humming sound.
Right.
And then also, obviously, when the mines get flooded with the goblins and everything, it reminded me of The Silver Chair. Right, the ending of The Silver Chair with their underground.
Oh, and the waters
really
break out.
Oh, yeah. What reminded me of The Silver Chair in this novel is the fact that the goblins trust their own light more than they kind of discount the light of the people in the upper world and think their light is superior, just like it happens with the witch in The Silver Chair.
Yeah, the humming is her spinning wheel, right? Oh,
Yes.
Like a cheerful bee.
Yeah.
The rings, they kind of had this magical hum. And obviously, once again, when you least expect it, he says it was like a Hoover running in another room. He's funny how he just doesn't mind breaking the fourth wall of fantasy and reminding us of our own world.
Well, McDonald says it's like the hum of a very happy bee that had found a rich well of honey in some globular flower.
Yeah.
As opposed to a Hoover in the other room.
in Lewis.
Well, I mean, spinning wheels, I had an uncle who used to make custom-made spinning wheels by hand out of the original wood. He just loved making things. When he got done with one, he would create another one. He had a storeroom that was full of antique spinning wheels that he'd made himself.
Oh, wow.
But when you get the pedals going and they're turning the yarn into twine, it hums like a happy bee.
Really?
Yeah. So that's an actual sound that he's recording there, the sound of a spinning wheel.
That's cool. So do we want to talk about the sequel, which we've kind of already been talking about?
Let me finish off this novel with a wonderful statement that at the end, things are, the goblins have been defeated, and the princess is told, we are told that by the narrator, that the truest princess loves all people. And so this emphasis on the inclusivism of being humble towards the poor. And also the narrator tells us it is contemptible to refuse to confess a fault or error. So MacDonald is getting in these wise principles to tell us even a princess, if pure, recognizes the importance that we're supposed to love all our neighbors.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's move on to The Princess and Curdie. And as you can tell from our podcast, they are so similar, even though they're 9 years apart. It gets confusing as to what incidents are in which novel, because at the beginning of this novel, we actually have now Curdie going upstairs and finding the grandmother, but not until after he shoots with an arrow a pure white pigeon.
Yeah.
And in the earlier novel, the princess finds out that her grandmother actually breeds pigeons and eats pigeon eggs. So now this second novel starts with Curdie killing a pigeon. Let's comment on that. What's the deal with the pigeons?
Are we somewhere in the world of the Ancient Mariner? He was quite well read.
Oh.
Is this kind of like shooting the albatross? Obviously, it's a kind of offense against nature to kill a living creature for no reason.
Yeah. It reminds me of the version of, I guess it's The Magician's Nephew that he didn't that he abandoned, where he goes out and he cuts down the tree branch, or he cuts down the tree. There's this sort of offense against nature that seems like it's a thing that young people do, especially young boys. I know that I did. We had an incident when I was with some of my friends, and we got BB guns, and we thought we were going to go hunt, and we started shooting at this poor squirrel, and he was running from tree to tree, and we were shooting him, and then we pretty quickly realized we were never going to actually hurt him or kill him. We were just torturing him with our BB guns, and I felt horrible about it. Because it was really an awful thing to do, but it was the sort of thing that you do as a young boy without thinking about it. And so Curdie, he goes up and he finds the grandmother, and because he realizes that it is one of her pigeons. And it was just really a moving scene in the story.
And he confesses what he's done. He actually carries it, and MacDonald describes it as white with this bloody mark in it. And the grandmother then forgives him. And what's interesting is that MacDonald describes then the pigeon's wings spreading out over her breast, which does sound like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where the mariner has to wear the albatross around his neck. Yeah. Although they have totally different significance. But
well, and I was going to say, white birds and stuff are often sort of a symbol of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
I saw sort of
that may be
sort of
part of intriguing our imagination as well.
Next week, we'll be interviewing an ornithologist, because we now have doves, albatrosses, pigeons.
Well, what's fascinating with about the Princess and Curdie, rather than deal with the threat of goblins underground, this has much more a socially relevant threat of people who are working for the king and are trying to kill him out of their own best interests. So his Lord Chamberlain and all these people who work in the palace are slowly poisoning Irene's father to death.
Right.
And so that is the real threat.
Yeah.
A threat like we see right now of Russians invading the Ukraine, people who destroy others in order to appropriate power for themselves.
Yeah, but that's a very profound fear that it's not just an overt attack, but it's this internal, they're coming from the inside sort of a palace intrigue situation, which I think makes it makes you feel even more powerless, because then it's almost like the first novel where you have to, there's an element of faith involved. You've got to get people in on the conspiracy and explain to them what's going on.
I think in a way it's more spiritually profound to see evil in ourselves and in other human beings.
Yes.
In the first story, it's like good comes from the attic. So many good things come from grandmother Irene, and the threat of evil comes from the mines and below the earth. Chesterton said that these stories changed his whole view of reality. He suddenly felt like that reality is multi-layered. We have these forces of good above us and these forces of evil below us, and we're trying to find our way between the two. But it's more realistic, I think, to not blame evil on goblins. Talk about the other, those other creatures.
Yeah, these hideous things.
Right.
Yeah.
And
In
to
fact,
say, wait a minute, it's our fellow human beings who should be respecting the king and looking up to the king. They're the ones who are the threat this time.
Don't the people trying to kill the king, people who work in his own household, don't they attribute some of their behavior to demons? It's kind of like
throw in,
Christians.
The devil made me do it.
Yeah, the devil made me do it.
Yeah. So can we also talk about the emerald that Curdie has?
Right.
So what's going on with that? I thought that was a very it's an interesting thing in the story. I'm not sure the role. It doesn't. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the emerald? I have a lot of questions about
This
it.
is the emerald that glows when he's in trouble, right?
Yeah,
so
and his father, he gives it to his father.
Well, now we have iPhones, so if you're in trouble, you call your parents. I thought it was kind of a symbol. He loves to take physical objects and give them a lot of symbolic overtones. And I wonder if that's meant to be another connection that a father knows when a child is struggling or in trouble, because they get this sort of signal. Once again, you don't want to be too allegorical.
Yeah.
But it's like the strings. It's a connection between the people that can help you and the people that are in trouble. There's always some sort of way in which there's a way out of that difficulty.
Gotcha.
So that was kind of the way I read it. Crystal, what do you think?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Let the record show, for the first time in 4 years of podcasting, Crystal's only response was, yeah.
Well, I'm sitting here contemplating this other strange aspect of the story. Even though the goblins are eliminated, there are all these 49 deformed creatures that help overthrow the rebellious staff who are trying to kill the king. And even staff members who aren't trying to kill the king, they're just thinking of what's in my own best interest. They're stealing gold. They're stealing whatever they can get from the king's palace. So not only these strange creatures, one of whom becomes the companion to Curdie.
Yeah, Lena.
Right. And now we get back to that important incident in the Rose Fire where Curdie finally sees the great-great-grandmother. She puts his hand into the Rose Fire. It burns, it hurts. But from then on, he is able to judge the inside of a person rather than the outside. And maybe I'm starting to answer my own question, because he encounters this ugly creature who is just horrific to look upon, but then when he takes the creature's paw, he feels a real human hand. He knows that the inside is good, versus the people in the king's court who are trying to overthrow him,
Right.
their appendages are starting to turn into animal appendages.
Right.
And so hoofs and claws.
Mm-hmm.
So they are descending into more animal-like behavior because they're thinking only of themselves, where these animals are coming to the rescue of the king. But why 49?
Yeah, why 49? That's not a very biblical number, is it?
Well, 7 times 7, isn't that 49?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
Well, 7
Okay.
is a biblical number.
Everyone do some Bible interpretation. Can you divide it by 7?
The part I was interested in was the idea that grandmother Irene gets a part of the plot to free the king by taking the
Yes.
guise of this ordinary woman. And it was kind of incarnational that she comes out of the attic. And
Yes.
she's not exactly a figure of providence anymore. She becomes engaged in the action to try to resolve the situation. Once again, you can't say it's allegorical, but it's fascinating symbolism.
It reminds me of Lewis talking about Sarah of Gilder's Green in Great Divorce,
Right.
which he places McDonald Great Divorce. Explain Sarah of Gilder's Green.
Well, the narrator has gotten to visit the outskirts of heaven and see all these encounters between these people who've been in hell who get a chance to go to heaven and perhaps stay there. And he sees this goddess-like figure who's so radiant and so huge, and she's surrounded by animals and birds, and she just seems to be some kind of a goddess of nature. And he says, who is that? Who was she on earth? She must be so important. And the guide says, oh, that was Sarah Smith of Golders Green. She was a charwoman, and nobody really noticed her much, but she had this magnificent Christian spirit.
Right.
So the idea that someone you would totally overlook on earth will be one of the great saints that you'll recognize in heaven.
Right. And so this housemaid
Yeah.
is, and all the
Interesting
other
connection.
people denounce her. They actually attack her, not just verbally, but physically, because she doesn't go along with them
Mhm.
to overthrow the king. And she stays on the side of goodness and peace. And it turns out, and we don't learn this, I'm sorry, spoiler alert, but I think you enjoy it better if you know this. It turns out it's the great grandmother, the supernatural principal of these stories, who has taken the form of a minor housemaid.
Right. I believe there's a rule that after 100 years, it's okay to do spoiler alerts. They've had an entire century to read this story, so if they haven't read it yet.
Okay.
Well, speaking of which, I wanted to ask about the ending.
Well, that was interesting, yeah.
Which is a very
Yes.
interesting way to end a fairy tale.
I know, it's very downbeat.
So, again, spoiler alert, but Irene and Curdie get married, and then they don't have any kids, and so the kingdom just kind of falls apart. What's going on there?
I love that, because rather than the artificiality of most fairy tales, and they lived happily ever after, which is not the way life really works,
Yeah.
that part of our fallen condition is that even when we, with the aid of God and God incarnate, we help transform evil into good, that doesn't mean evil is conquered. And so at the very end of this story, evil rises again. And that is the way life is.
It's kind of ironic to have you talk about a fairy tale ending. Here's a real fairy tale that doesn't have a fairy tale ending.
I know. That's
It's
what
like
makes
the
it so
spiritual
brilliant.
battle has to be fought anew every generation. We have no abiding city. The spiritual battle goes on.
Right. And also, George MacDonald gets into this story, unlike the first one, a little dig at superficial clergymen who just make palliative statements, aren't dedicated to seeking truth, justice, mercy, let alone God. And they are just the party of decency. It's all just about being decent.
Yeah.
And they do not counter the evil of other people who are just being self-indulgent.
Yeah.
We're going to run into this again when we read or talk about At the Back of the North Wind. McDonald was unusual in that he himself had a lot of suffering. I think he had 4 children who died before they reached adulthood. His health wasn't good. But he really builds some darkness and some suffering into his stories. He doesn't go for the classic fairy tale. So I think part of his spiritual depth is being willing to embrace the struggle and embrace the darkness rather than give people a false view of what reality is like, even in fairy tales.
Yeah. The thing, one of the elements I found interesting about these, reading back to them again, was the way that he'll pause and have these sort of, the narrator is like, it's like it's designed to be read to children. And so he'll be like, what do you think could be on the other side of the door? Or what do you think he was feeling in this moment? And then he goes back into the story. And so he has these moments. There's even one early on in The Princess and the Goblin where he's talking to an artist who may paint this. He's like, oh, if you're an artist, I wouldn't bother with the toys. And I'm
I'm
like, what is going on?
Right.
As he kind of pulls away from the story and is like, by the way, if you're going to illustrate this, don't worry about the toys. This is the main thing to focus on.
A lot of the narrator in the Narnia Chronicles.
Yes.
It's very much like your uncle reading to you in front of the fire or by the bedside.
But it's built into the story.
Yeah, it is.
Which I found very funny. It's almost like he's designed it for parents to read it to their children.
Right.
And he's done something similar when he was reading it to his own kids. What do you think's behind the door?
Yeah, Tolkien complained about that. He didn't like some of these elements of McDonald.
Oh, really?
You notice in Lord of the Rings, we don't have an avuncular narrator.
This is true, yeah.
He never says, oh, if you're illustrating this, there's only one place that I can find in all of Lord of the Rings where he says I, and they're getting ready to leave Rivendell and go on their great quest. The narrator says, Sam was worried that he hadn't packed enough pipeweed, and I agree with him. So the only thing that would bring Tolkien into his own story was nicotine. That was the only thing.
So what else stands out from these stories?
As I look back on the whole story, I have to go back to this wonderful scene where Curdie puts his hands in the rose fire, and then when he takes them out, he's gone through a lot of pain. But when he feels this monstrous creature, he feels this the spirit of a beautiful little girl. It takes me back when I was a little boy. I had to get eye surgery, and my eyes were bandaged for a week in the hospital. And it was a military hospital where your parents could only visit for 2 hours a day. And my eyes were bandaged, but I had this wonderful nurse who I thought must look like Mary Poppins. She had this musical voice, and she laughed, and she would sing little songs, and she would come talk to me and tell me stories. And then when the bandages came off, she was much older, and she was very overweight, and she had a lot of problems with her complexion.
Oh, really?
But I'd been seeing her spirit for a whole week, and I'd just been experiencing this wonderful, beautiful Julie Andrews personality. And it was a great spiritual lesson to see someone's spirit for a week before you see physically how they appear to the eyes. So that incident reminded me of that childhood episode.
Yeah. There was a one random encounter that stood out to me from The Princess and the Goblin I wanted to mention. She's having this talk with her great grandmother, and she's talking about Ludi, and she tells Ludi, her nurse, about the great grandmother, and she doesn't believe, and she thinks she's being silly. Of course, the way she tells it, she's like, "I found an old lady in the attic, and she eats pigeon eggs." And, so it sounds like a kid making up a story. But she's talking about how she feels ashamed of herself, and she doesn't understand why Ludi wouldn't come. And so she says, Irene, the grandmother, is talking. She says, well, you've come again, and Ludi wouldn't have come again. She would have said, no, she's had enough of such nonsense, meaning that Ludi wouldn't have let her come, and Ludi wouldn't want to come see the grandmother.
Right.
And then, so Irene says, is it naughty of Ludi then? Meaning, has she done something wrong by not wanting to come see you? And she says, it would be naughty of you. I've never done anything for Ludi. Now, I don't want to read too much into that, but the element of divine providence and this sort of God image in the grandmother and how she's doing these things and taking care and showing grace, and there's an element of redemption on the rose fire. But just that small little line there, like, I haven't done anything for Ludi, to me just stood out, because this idea,
that is interesting, right?
Like, no, Ludi doesn't owe me anything because I haven't interacted with her yet. And it reminded me of one of the elements in the Chronicles of Narnia where they want to know about the spiritual fate of other people.
Right.
And Aslan's like, no, that's not for you to know. That's for me and them. You don't need to worry about other people's spiritual journey. You just need to worry about yours. And so I just thought that was just a neat element. There's just that small little line there. No, I haven't done anything for her. It wouldn't have been wrong for her to not come to me.
It's interesting of you to pick that out because George MacDonald mentioned a passage in John where the other disciples say, is it true that John is not going to die? And Jesus says, what is that to you? Follow thou me. And it's kind of this doctrine of privacy. I'm working with each person individually, and you don't need to see what I'm doing in other people's lives.
Yeah.
And Lewis got that verse from McDonald. I think it's in Unspoken Sermons.
Oh, okay.
And he used it in Narnia.
Yeah.
They would say, what did you say to Edmund, or what would have happened? And they have this kind of idle curiosity, and Aslan tells them, just worry about your story. Worry about what did happen, not what would have happened.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you made that connection because Lewis picked up that idea from reading McDonald. So that's definitely a valid connection.
And this is something else related to that stood out to me back in The Princess and the Goblin, where the great-great-grandmother tells Irene, who is really discouraged, that Curdie doesn't see anything. Curdie is kind of disgusted with her that she makes up this story, kind of like Ludi just doesn't believe the story. And the grandmother says, you must not be hard on people who believe less. And then the grandmother says to Irene, you must be content not to be believed. And those are two principles so relevant to us today that we can't judge people who have trouble coming to faith, and we can't become discontented when they don't take us seriously.
Don't believe us.
Well, a big thing in McDonald's, and it is in these stories, is this element of there is a level of responsibility that we have to seek God, but then there's also an element that he has to intervene. He has to step in, and grace has to come down and reach down towards us, and so. It's not fair of us, it's not right of us to judge someone else for where they are in their faith journey, because, it's like, who knows what, God has done with that person up until this point, and it may be different than you. They may just be at a different point in their journey. Or maybe they rejected God, who knows, but that's between them and the Lord, and it's not between you and them.
Yes.
Right. That's good.
Once again, that principle of love.
Yeah.
You love not only God, you love your neighbor, even when your neighbor is resistant to your own love of God.
Yeah.
Right. My other takeaway is you can be at least 50 years old and still do some good in the world. I find that very encouraging.
Yeah, because at one point she hints that like she's going to live to be 2,000 or something. So I'm like, how old is she really? But he keeps mentioning 50 as like that's the mark of like an old person.
Right.
Well, when we were all little kids, 50 was.
This is true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is true. Well, we are going to be going on vacations. And so we're not going to take a break, but we're going to play a rerun next week, an oldie but a goodie. So hopefully you guys can check that out. And then we're going to come back to George MacDonald. Is that correct?
Eventually, yes.
Okay.
We're going to have.
I think we're going to do several of his other short stories. And then later on in the summer, we're going to talk to Jerry Root about God in the Dock.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So we got some good stuff coming up, and we'll see you guys in a couple of weeks.
I want Erin to do a blooper reel where I say, Crystal, what do you think about that? She just goes, yeah.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.